Nutrient control and stability for most people is just more simple than it seems. The primary input of nitrate and phosphate into the tank is just food. Meaning if you put more food in, there'll be more nitrate and phosphate. If you put less in, there'll be less. This is an obvious lever, but it's also often missed. And when you get good at this, you can use food control to control phosphate and nitrate independently of each other. However, historically, the goals for nutrients were really not all that clear. It used to be feed as little as humanly possible so we could avoid elevated nitrate and phosphate in the tank. Many people only feeding a few pellets every couple of days. However, during that period of time, fish were mysteriously dying all the time as well. Fast forward to today, and food really isn't about nitrate and phosphate anymore because filtration has caught up with the ability to feed, and now food is really about fish nutrition and caring for the nutritional needs of the animal. And now when we're thinking about how do we take care of that animal, we're watching the fish for signs of health, growth, size, color, wounds, and open sores, telling us when we're meeting the needs of the fish and animal. We're also now addressing the obvious. Active fish that swim around a lot and burn a lot of calories simply need more food, and once we address that, they just simply stop dying. It's not really a big surprise after the fact. However, we're now inputting more nitrogen and phosphorus or food in the tank, and so we need to test and find out if it's stable. If it is stable and inside of a range that you're comfortable with, congratulations, you probably don't need to do anything. However, if it's unstable and you're finding that increased amount of food is causing perpetually rising nitrate and phosphate, you do need to solve, and as long as it fits the nutritional needs of the fish, you can actually just lower the amount of food you put in the tank, and it's as simple as that. But also, you may find that just one of these things is rising, meaning nitrate is stable, but phosphate is rising, or phosphate is stable and nitrate's rising. You can solve for that as well. Selecting a different food, probably the tool that you'll use to fix for that, because different foods have different phosphate to nitrate ratios in them, and you can match this to your problem that you're having. So for instance, if you're finding that phosphate is actually really stable in your tank, it doesn't change a lot, but over time nitrate is rising, you can solve for that by selecting something with a lower nitrogen to phosphorus ratio food. In this case, in most cases, it would actually be a dry food that would have that type of ratio. So if you have stable phosphate but elevating nitrate, maybe try some dry foods or just try different foods to solve for that issue. However, probably more common than that is actually the inverse of that problem, where nitrate's actually fairly stable, but we're constantly having a problem with rising phosphate and we just can't get it to meet our goals. So in that case, try something with a lower phosphate ratio. And in this case, it's frozen foods that typically have a lower content of phosphate. So again, if you're having a problem where stable nitrate but rising phosphate, frozen foods are probably one of the best answers, at least one to try. Pay attention to what's in it. Read the packaging. It could be seafood, algae, terrestrial foods, animals, grains, or fruits. All these things will have different contents of nitrogen and phosphorus, and when you add them to the tank, have a different input ratio. And you can change these things. I'm not saying play mad scientist where you want to check it every week or even month, but quarterly, consider changing your food to match your needs. But again, if both of these elements are rising, you probably just want to stop feeding so much. It's really about feeding the right amount and scale back if it makes sense. However, it doesn't mean you have to hurt the nutritional needs of the fish. There are other ways to actually solve and make sure that they're still getting that nutrition. The biggest opportunity, or at least cheapest opportunity, is probably a feeding ring that just floats on the surface of the water and stops all the fish food from going directly down the drain. The ring holds it in and allows the fish to feed out of it. This alone might allow you to feed as much as half as much food and still get the nutrition to the fish. Another tool that many of us have overlooked is the feed modes on our controllers, power heads, and return pumps. These things, again, may allow you to feed half as much while still getting the same amount of nutrition to your fish, meaning half of the nitrogen and phosphorus input, which really kind of means like half the water changes and half the reliance on your filtration as well. So in this case, when we turn off the flow, you'll see the food just slowly sink to the bottom where the fish are capturing a vast majority of it, and very little of it is getting blown around and lost into the tank or sucked up into the filtration. The inverse of this is also actually true in many cases. I've seen it in my own tank, which is with flow and bare bottoms, you can actually get it resuspended, meaning after your feed mode is turned off and a lot of the food is settled on the bottom, if I have a bare bottom and flow going across the bottom, it flushes it back up into suspension, and very, very little of the food gets lost in the tank, and what does get into there is either eaten or then removed by the filtration as well. It's also sometimes helpful to just acknowledge that you may have a heavy-handed approach to feeding, just because it's enjoyable. It's one of the ways that we interact with the fish in the tank and just one of the most fun things we can do. So if that's the case, it's helpful to acknowledge that because you can change the type of foods that you use, meaning if we're using pellets, it's high density nutrition, lots of nitrate and phosphate for a very small amount of food. However, with frozen foods, if you look at it, it's actually largely water. So it may feel like you're feeding a lot and frequently, but actually it isn't polluting the tank in the same way. So frozen foods, if you have a heavy hand, maybe just a better option. Also, acknowledging that means upping our filtration game and finding ways to make sure we take out that excess nitrate, even the excess food, and that's coming up next.